October 1947. The office on Madison Avenue occupied the 8th floor of a building that had been constructed in the previous decade. The room was furnished with mahogany furniture, burgundy leather chairs, and brass fixtures that reflected the afternoon light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the street below, where traffic moved steadily through Midtown Manhattan. At 3:30 on a Thursday afternoon, the office held 7 men seated around a conference table. 6 wore expensive suits purchased from tailors on Fifth Avenue. The 7th wore a charcoal suit of comparable quality but different origin, made by a tailor in Harlem who knew his measurements and preferences. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson sat at one end of the conference table, his hands folded, his expression neutral. At 42 years old, he controlled the numbers racket throughout Harlem and maintained working arrangements with the Italian crime families that governed organized crime throughout New York. These arrangements, negotiated over the previous decade following the death of Dutch Schultz, allowed Johnson to operate with relative independence in Harlem while paying tribute to the larger Italian organizations that controlled importation, wholesale distribution, and political protection. The meeting had been called by Vincent Mangano, who represented the Gambino family's interests in expanding drug distribution networks throughout the city. Mangano was 53 years old, a man who had spent 30 years in organized crime and held significant influence within the commission that coordinated activities among the 5 families. He sat at the opposite end of the table from Johnson, flanked by 2 attorneys and 2 other representatives from Italian crime families. On the table between them lay a document. The document was 12 pages long, typed on legal paper, bound with a blue cover. It had been prepared by the attorneys present, reviewed by multiple parties, and represented what Mangano described as a comprehensive restructuring of drug distribution arrangements in New York City. Mangano explained that heroin importation from Europe was increasing. New supply chains were being established. Distribution networks were expanding. The families had decided that coordination was necessary to avoid conflicts, maximize efficiency, and ensure that everyone received appropriate compensation for their roles in the distribution chain. The document on the table formalized these arrangements. According to the terms outlined by Mangano, Johnson would serve as the Harlem Distribution Coordinator. He would manage street-level sales, coordinate with local dealers, collect payments, and ensure security for operations in his territory. In exchange, he would receive 15% of the net profit from all heroin sold in Harlem. The remaining 85% would be divided among the families according to formulas specified in the contract. All product would be supplied exclusively by the families. Johnson would have no authority to source product independently. All pricing would be determined by the families. Johnson would implement whatever prices were set regardless of local market conditions. The contract specified that these arrangements would remain in effect for 10 years, with automatic renewal unless terminated by mutual agreement of all parties. It included provisions for resolving disputes through arbitration overseen by the Commission. It outlined penalties for breach of contract, including financial damages and potential loss of territory. Mangano presented this as a business opportunity. He emphasized the profits that would flow to Johnson from the 15% share. He noted that this was higher than the percentage offered to distributors in other territories. He suggested that Johnson should view this as recognition of his importance and capability. Johnson read the contract carefully. He took nearly 30 minutes to review all 12 pages, reading each provision, each clause, each specification of terms and conditions. The other men at the table waited, making occasional small talk among themselves, but primarily watching Johnson read. When Johnson finished reading, he placed the contract back on the table. He asked several questions about specific provisions. What would happen if market conditions in Harlem required different pricing than the families wanted to impose? What recourse would exist if the quality of supplied product was inadequate? How would disputes about payment calculations be resolved? What would happen if Johnson identified more efficient distribution methods that the families had not approved? The attorneys answered these questions with references to specific contract provisions. The contract anticipated these scenarios and provided mechanisms for addressing them. In each case, our final authority rested with the families. Johnson could raise concerns, make suggestions, present evidence, but decisions would be made by the Commission, and Johnson would be bound to implement those decisions. Johnson asked one more question. He asked whether, under these terms, he would maintain the independence to refuse product that he believed would harm the Harlem community more than other available options. He asked whether he would retain authority to limit distribution in ways that protected community interests, even if doing so reduced profits. The response was polite, but clear. The contract governed business operations. Johnson's role was distribution and security. Policy decisions about what products to distribute and in what quantities were made by the families based on supply availability and profit maximization. Community concerns were not relevant to these business decisions. Johnson nodded slowly. He looked at the contract one more time, then he picked it up, held it with both hands, and tore it in half. He placed the two halves together and tore them again. He continued tearing the pages into smaller and smaller pieces until the conference table was covered with fragments of paper. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. Mangano called after him, asking what he thought he was doing. Johnson paused at the door, but did not turn around. He said that he had read the contract, understood its terms, and declined to sign it. Had he said that the arrangements that had governed his relationship with the families for the past decade would continue unless someone wanted to renegotiate them through direct conversation rather than through documents prepared by attorneys. Then he left the office, walked to the elevator, descended to the ground floor, and walked out onto Madison Avenue. The afternoon was cool, the October air carrying the first hints of coming winter. He walked west toward the subway station, hands in his pockets, expression unchanged from when he had entered the building an hour earlier. The subway ride back to Harlem took 20 minutes. Johnson stood holding a pole, swaying slightly with the train's movement, surrounded by people returning home from work or heading into Manhattan for evening activities. And no one recognized him or paid him particular attention. He was simply another well-dressed man riding the train, but his mind was working through what had just occurred and what it meant. The contract represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between Johnson and the Italian families. For a decade, that relationship had been based on mutual respect and practical accommodation. Johnson controlled Harlem. The families controlled importation and wholesale distribution. Johnson bought product from the families, distributed it through his networks, and paid the families a percentage of profits. But he maintained authority over how distribution occurred, what prices were charged, and how operations were managed within his territory. The new contract would have eliminated that authority. It would have transformed Johnson from an independent operator who did business with the families into an employee who implemented decisions made by others. The 15% payment was not compensation for independent business activity. It was a salary for performing designated functions under someone else's direction. This transformation was not about Johnson personally. It was about power structures and how they were evolving as drug distribution became more profitable than gambling operations. The families recognized that heroin generated enormous revenues but also created significant risks. They wanted centralized control to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure to law enforcement. Creating formal contractual arrangements with distributors was part of this centralization, but centralization also meant subordination. If Johnson signed the contract, he would no longer be the independent operator who controlled Harlem's Underworld. He would be a regional manager in a corporate structure controlled from outside his territory. And once that structure was established, it would be nearly impossible to change. The 10-year term with automatic renewal meant that an entire generation would grow up under a system where Harlem's criminal operations were subordinate to external authority. This had implications beyond Johnson's personal status. If Harlem's distribution networks were controlled by outside families, those families would make decisions based on their own interests rather than Harlem's interests. If flooding the neighborhood with cheap, highly addictive heroin maximized profits, that would happen regardless of the community impact. If maintaining high prices to maximize margins meant that desperate addicts committed more crimes to afford their habits, that would be acceptable as long as profits remained strong. Johnson had spent 15 years building power in Harlem. That power came from being useful to the community even while engaging in illegal activity. He provided employment. He mediated disputes. He protected local businesses from outside predators. He operated gambling enterprises that people chose to participate in voluntarily. Drug distribution was different. It created compulsive use that destroyed families. But as long as Johnson maintained some independent authority, he could moderate that destruction by controlling quality, limiting availability, and refusing to distribute the most dangerous products. The contract would have eliminated that moderating influence. And Johnson understood that once he signed away his independence, he would never get it back. The families would have legal documents giving them authority over Harlem's distribution networks. They would have precedent. They would have established systems. Breaking free from those systems would require either legal challenges that Johnson could not win or violent conflict that would destroy Harlem in the process. So, tearing up the contract was not an impulsive act of defiance. It was a strategic decision to prevent a system from being established that would be impossible to dismantle once it existed. But making that decision created immediate problems. The families would not accept rejection gracefully. They would apply pressure to force Johnson to reconsider. And if pressure did not work, they would seek to remove him and install someone more compliant in his position. Johnson needed to make the costs of removing him higher than the benefits of doing so. He needed to demonstrate that attempting to impose the contract's terms by force would be more expensive and less effective than maintaining the existing arrangements. And he needed to do this without triggering the kind of violent conflict that would bring law enforcement attention and destabilize the entire region. This required building a coalition of allies who could apply different kinds of pressure simultaneously. The first meeting was with Thomas Bradley, a lawyer who specialized in commercial contracts and had represented various Harlem business interests for 20 years. Bradley was 58 years old, black, and deeply connected to both the legal community and the political networks that governed New York City. He understood how contracts functioned, how they were enforced, and how they could be challenged. Johnson explained what had occurred. He described the contract, its terms, and why he had rejected it. He asked Bradley to review contract law related to agreements involving illegal activities. Specifically, he asked whether a contract governing heroin distribution would be enforceable in any legal venue. Bradley confirmed what Johnson suspected. Contracts related to illegal activities were void as a matter of public policy. Courts would not enforce them. This meant that the contract the families had prepared had no legal force. It was simply a piece of paper expressing intentions and agreements. But those agreements could not be enforced through any legal mechanism. However, Bradley noted, the absence of legal enforceability did not prevent the contract from having practical effects. In the criminal underworld, agreements were enforced through reputation and force. If Johnson agreed to the contract's terms and then violated them, the families would respond with economic sanctions or violence. The lack of legal enforceability was irrelevant to how the criminal world operated. But, Bradley observed, the lack of legal enforceability also meant that Johnson's rejection of the contract had no legal consequences. He could not be sued for breach of contract. He could not be compelled to perform under its terms. The families could only respond through extra-legal means, which carried their own risks and costs. Bradley agreed to prepare a memorandum analyzing the contract from a legal perspective, highlighting its unenforceability and documenting that Johnson's existing arrangements with the families were not governed by any written agreement, but rather by customary practice and mutual accommodation. The second meeting was with Reverend Marcus Washington, pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential religious institutions. Washington was 61 years old, a man who had led his congregation for 23 years and commanded enormous respect throughout the community. He was not naive about criminal activity in Harlem, but he also understood that community leaders needed to work with existing power structures to protect residents from worse alternatives. Johnson explained that external families wanted to impose new arrangements that would increase drug distribution in Harlem while removing local authority over how that distribution occurred. He explained that he had rejected these arrangements because they would harm the community. He asked whether church leaders might be willing to speak publicly about the dangers of increased drug availability and the importance of community control over local conditions. Washington understood immediately. The church had been fighting drug addiction for years. The congregation included families destroyed by heroin. If distribution increased under terms that prioritized profit over community impact, the devastation would worsen. Having local authority that could moderate distribution was preferable to having no local authority at all. Washington agreed to organize a coalition of pastors to speak about drug addiction as a community crisis, requiring community-based solutions rather than external intervention. The message would not defend criminal activity, but it would emphasize that Harlem needed local leadership that understood and cared about local conditions. The third meeting was with Samuel Henderson, who operated several legitimate businesses in Harlem, including a construction company, a trucking firm, and a wholesale food distribution operation. Henderson was 49 years old, a man who had built his businesses over 25 years through a combination of hard work, strategic thinking, and careful navigation of the complex relationships between legitimate commerce and illegal enterprises. Johnson explained that the Italian families wanted to centralize control over drug distribution in ways that would affect not just illegal operations, but also legitimate businesses. If the families controlled distribution absolutely, they could demand that legitimate businesses provide services, transportation, storage, money laundering, without negotiation or fair compensation. The families would have leverage because they would control the economic activity that generated much of Harlem's cash flow. Henderson recognized the threat. His businesses already had to navigate relationships with criminal enterprises. If those enterprises were controlled by external families rather than local operators, his negotiating position would weaken. External families cared nothing about maintaining good relationships with Harlem businesses, and they would simply demand compliance and punish resistance. Henderson agreed to organize other legitimate business owners to document the importance of local economic autonomy. They would emphasize that Harlem's economy functioned best when local operators controlled local activities and when business relationships were based on mutual benefit rather than external imposition. The fourth meeting was with Dorothy Mitchell, who ran a tenants organization that represented thousands of Harlem residents living in apartment buildings throughout the neighborhood. Mitchell was 53 years old, a woman who had spent 20 years organizing tenants to demand better housing conditions, fair rent, and protection from arbitrary eviction. Johnson explained that increased drug distribution under external control would mean more addiction, more crime, and more instability in residential buildings. Landlords would use drug-related problems as justification for evicting tenants. Buildings would deteriorate as drug activity drove out stable families. The quality of life for everyone would decline. Mitchell needed no convincing. She had watched heroin destroy families and neighborhoods. If distribution increased without local moderating influence, the damage would accelerate. She agreed to mobilize tenant organizations to demand that city officials address drug distribution as a public health and housing stability issue requiring community-based approaches. Over the next month, these allies began executing their parts of a coordinated strategy. The strategy did not directly confront the Italian families. Instead, it created an environment where imposing the contract's terms by force would be politically and economically costly. Thomas Bradley's legal memorandum was distributed quietly to certain judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who had relationships with both the criminal underworld and the legitimate political system. The memorandum made clear that any formalized drug distribution arrangements would lack legal enforceability, which meant that disputes would be resolved through violence rather than legal channels. This would create instability that law enforcement would need to address, consuming resources and creating political problems. Reverend Washington's coalition of pastors began holding community meetings about drug addiction. These meetings were covered by the Amsterdam News and other black newspapers. The pastors spoke about heroin as a scourge destroying Harlem families. They called for community-based responses that addressed addiction as a health issue rather than simply a law enforcement problem. They emphasized that external interests profiting from drug distribution cared nothing about community well-being. Samuel Henderson's organization of business owners documented the interconnections between legitimate commerce and illegal enterprises in Harlem's economy. They showed that local control over illegal activities meant those activities were conducted in ways that minimized disruption to legitimate business. External control would eliminate that consideration, making illegal activities more disruptive and forcing legitimate businesses to either accommodate external demands or cease operations. And Dorothy Mitchell's tenant organizations began organizing around housing stability and drug-related crime. They documented buildings where drug distribution had increased and showed the correlation with tenant displacement, building deterioration, and neighborhood decline. They demanded that city officials address drug distribution not just through arrests, but through community-based interventions that reduced demand and provided treatment. While these public activities were creating visibility and political pressure, Johnson was also taking direct action to demonstrate that the existing arrangements were sustainable and preferable to the alternatives the families wanted to impose. He restructured his distribution networks to reduce visibility and vulnerability to enforcement actions. Operations that had been concentrated in specific locations were dispersed across multiple sites. Street-level dealers were given more autonomy to adapt to local conditions, which made the overall network more resilient. Quality control was improved to reduce overdoses and health crises that brought law enforcement attention. He also began developing alternative supply sources. The Italian families controlled European heroin importation, but other supply chains existed. Through contacts in the Caribbean and eventually in Southeast Asia, Johnson began identifying suppliers who could provide product independent of Italian family control. These alternative sources would take time to develop and would initially be more expensive, but they would eliminate the family's monopoly on supply. Additionally, Johnson invested more heavily in gambling operations and other illegal enterprises that did not depend on Italian family cooperation. He expanded numbers operations, improved collection systems, and developed new games that appealed to Harlem residents. These investments diversified his revenue sources and reduced his dependence on drug distribution profits. By December 1947, 2 months after Johnson had torn up the contract, the Italian families faced a situation they had not anticipated. The contract was supposed to formalize arrangements and create predictability. Instead, its rejection had created uncertainty and mobilized opposition. Community organizations were speaking publicly about the dangers of external control over local conditions. Business organizations were documenting the importance of local economic autonomy. Law enforcement officials were being briefed about how formalized drug distribution agreements would create instability, requiring increased enforcement resources. And Johnson's operations were continuing successfully without family oversight, demonstrating that the centralized control the contract would have imposed was not necessary for effective operations. The families could have responded with force. They could have attempted to remove Johnson and install someone who would sign the contract. But such actions would trigger exactly the kind of instability that the contract was supposedly designed to prevent. A violent conflict in Harlem would bring intense law enforcement attention. It would disrupt operations throughout the region. And it would create opportunities for other criminal organizations to move into territory that became contested. Moreover, the community mobilization that had occurred in response to the contract's rejection meant that any attempt to impose external control by force would face resistance, not just from Johnson's organization, but from churches, businesses, and tenant groups throughout Harlem. The families would be fighting not just against one man, but against an entire community that had been organized to resist external domination. In January 1948, Vincent Mangano requested a meeting with Johnson. The meeting occurred at a restaurant in neutral territory, not in Harlem and not in Italian-controlled areas of the city. Mangano came alone, as did Johnson. Mangano began by acknowledging that the contract approach had created complications. Yet he said the families still believed coordination was necessary for efficient drug distribution, but perhaps the specific terms proposed had been too restrictive. He asked what arrangements Johnson would find acceptable. Johnson's response was simple. The arrangements that had existed for the past decade worked well. He purchased product from the families at negotiated prices. He distributed product through his networks according to his judgment about local conditions. He paid the families an agreed percentage of profits. These arrangements required no formal contracts. They functioned on mutual benefit and mutual respect. If the families wanted to discuss specific operational issues, pricing, quality, payment schedules, Johnson was willing to negotiate those issues, but any agreements would be based on ongoing mutual consent, not on binding contracts that eliminated independent authority. Mangano asked what would prevent Johnson from simply stopping payments to the families once he had established alternative supply sources. Johnson replied that the same thing that had prevented such problems for the past decade would continue to prevent them: mutual benefit and mutual respect. The families provided services, supply, political protection, mediation with other criminal organizations that Johnson valued. As long as those services continued and were fairly priced, Johnson would continue paying for them. If the families attempted to overcharge or provide inadequate service, Johnson would seek alternatives. That was normal market dynamics. Mangano was quiet for a long moment, and then he acknowledged that this arrangement was probably preferable to the conflict that would result from attempting to impose the contract by force. He said the families would maintain the existing arrangements and would abandon efforts to formalize them through contractual agreements. The victory was visible and verifiable. The contract that would have subordinated Johnson's operations to external control was not just rejected, but abandoned. The families made no further attempts to impose similar arrangements. Distribution operations in Harlem continued under Johnson's authority, governed by informal understandings rather than formal agreements. The community organizations that had mobilized in response to the contract threat remained active and vigilant, ready to respond to future threats to local autonomy. And the immediate crisis was resolved, but the deeper significance of what had occurred took years to fully manifest. By tearing up the contract, Johnson had established a precedent that shaped organized crime relationships throughout New York for the next 2 decades. The Italian families learned that attempts to formalize control over black-operated territories through contractual arrangements would generate resistance that made such control more costly than it was worth. They learned that informal arrangements based on mutual benefit were more sustainable than formal structures based on subordination. This lesson influenced how the families approached relationships with other ethnic criminal organizations throughout the city, Puerto Rican operators in East Harlem, Jewish operators in certain Brooklyn neighborhoods. And other groups were able to maintain relative autonomy because the families had learned from the Harlem contract incident that attempting to impose formal control generated more problems than benefits. The community organizations that had formed in response to the contract threat also had lasting impact. The coalition of pastors that Reverend Washington had assembled continued meeting and eventually became a significant force in Harlem politics, advocating on issues far beyond drug distribution. The business organization that Samuel Henderson had created became a chamber of commerce that negotiated with city officials on economic development issues. The tenant organizations that Dorothy Mitchell had mobilized became permanent advocacy groups that shaped housing policy in Harlem for decades. And these organizations existed because Johnson's rejection of the contract had demonstrated that coordinated community resistance could prevent external domination. People had seen that standing together against external threats was possible and effective. This lesson was applied to other threats: urban renewal projects that displaced residents, discriminatory lending practices that prevented black business ownership, police brutality that went unpunished. The legal framework that Thomas Bradley had developed analyzing the unenforceability of criminal contracts became precedent that other lawyers used in various contexts. The fundamental principle that agreements related to illegal activities could not be legally enforced became a tool for resisting exploitation. Criminal organizations that attempted to use contract-like arrangements to bind people to disadvantageous terms discovered that those arrangements had no legal force and could be repudiated without legal consequence. Johnson's development of alternative supply sources also had long-term effects. By demonstrating that Italian family monopolies could be broken through development of independent supply chains, Johnson created a template that other operators followed. By the 1960s, when Frank Lucas and others began importing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, they were building on infrastructure and relationships that Johnson had begun developing in the late 1940s in response to the contract threat. The diversification of Johnson's operations away from drug distribution and toward gambling and other enterprises also influenced how criminal organizations structured their activities. By showing that dependence on any single revenue source created vulnerability, Johnson encouraged more balanced approaches that reduced risk and increased sustainability. When Johnson died in 1968, 21 years after tearing up the contract, the organized crime landscape in Harlem and throughout New York reflected the consequences of that decision. No major criminal organization operated under formalized contractual arrangements. Relationships were based on ongoing negotiations and mutual benefit rather than binding agreements. Black operators in Harlem maintained substantial autonomy in their operations. Community organizations remained vigilant about external threats to local control. The contract itself, or rather, the torn pieces of it, disappeared on the afternoon Johnson destroyed it. Office staff at the Madison Avenue building swept up the paper fragments and disposed of them. No copies were ever produced. The families apparently decided that documenting their failed attempt to formalize control served no purpose. But the absence of documentation did not mean the incident was forgotten. People in Harlem knew what had happened. They knew that Johnson had been presented with an agreement that would have made him subordinate to external authority. They knew he had rejected it publicly and decisively. They knew that the families had backed down rather than fight a war they might not win. This knowledge shaped how people thought about power and resistance. It demonstrated that even powerful external organizations could be resisted successfully if resistance was strategic and comprehensive. It showed that tearing up an exploitative agreement was only the first step in a longer process of building systems that prevented such agreements from being imposed in the future. The story was told and retold in various forms. Sometimes it focused on the dramatic moment of tearing up the contract. Sometimes it emphasized the strategic coalition building that followed. Sometimes it highlighted the long-term consequences for community organizing and political mobilization. But always, the story carried the same lesson. Power came not from accepting the terms offered by those who seemed stronger, but from understanding the systems that generated those terms and building alternatives that made the terms irrelevant. For Johnson personally, the incident confirmed an approach to power that had guided him throughout his career. Power was not about controlling territory or accumulating wealth, though both were necessary. Power was about maintaining independence and autonomy, about refusing to be subordinated to systems that would use you for their purposes without regard for your interests or your community's interests. The contract the families had offered promised wealth. 15% of massive drug distribution profits would have made Johnson extremely rich, but it would have done so by making him dependent on family decisions, family supply chains, family approval. Tearing up the contract meant accepting less certain and potentially smaller profits, but it preserved the independence to make decisions based on his own judgment and community considerations. This trade-off between wealth and autonomy was fundamental to how Johnson understood power. Wealthy subordinates were still subordinates. They could be directed, replaced, or eliminated whenever their usefulness ended. Independent operators with modest resources were more sustainable and ultimately more powerful than wealthy subordinates, because independence meant the ability to adapt, resist, and survive regardless of what external powers wanted. The decades-long aftermath of tearing up the contract validated this understanding. Johnson operated in Harlem until his death, without being subordinated to external control. The systems he built to resist that subordination outlasted him and continued protecting community autonomy long after he was gone. The precedent he established influenced how organized crime operated throughout New York and shaped how communities organized to resist exploitation. There was no celebration when the families agreed to abandon their contract and maintain existing informal arrangements. Johnson did not publicize his victory or seek recognition for what he had accomplished. The community organizations that had mobilized did not declare triumph. They simply continued their work, knowing that defending autonomy required constant vigilance. This absence of celebration was itself significant. It reflected an understanding that power struggles were ongoing processes, not discrete events with clear conclusions. And tearing up the contract was one moment in a continuous effort to maintain independence against organizations that constantly sought to expand control. The fact that this particular threat had been defeated did not mean new threats would not emerge, and new threats did emerge. Over the following 2 decades, Johnson faced various attempts by Italian families, law enforcement, political organizations, and other groups to limit his authority or eliminate his operations. Each threat required strategic response. Each response built on lessons learned from previous conflicts. The skills, relationships, and systems developed in response to the contract incident were used repeatedly to address subsequent challenges. This was the true legacy of the torn contract. Not that one threat had been defeated, but that defeating it had created capabilities and relationships that made future threats manageable. The coalition-building skills demonstrated in organizing pastors, businesses, and tenant groups were applied to other organizing efforts. The legal analysis of contract unenforceability was refined and used in other contexts. The alternative supply chain development continued and expanded. The diversification of operations reduced vulnerability to any single point of failure. Each of these developments made Johnson's organization and the broader Harlem community more resilient, more capable of resisting external domination, more able to maintain autonomy, even in the face of powerful organizations that wanted to eliminate that autonomy. When historians later examined organized crime in mid-20th century New York, and they often focused on the Italian families and their expansion of power throughout the city, they documented the commission, the 5 families, the various power struggles among Italian operators. They treated black criminal organizations as peripheral, subordinate to the Italian power structure. This analysis missed the significance of what Johnson had accomplished. By maintaining independence and autonomy in Harlem, despite constant pressure from more powerful organizations, he had demonstrated that subordination was not inevitable. He had shown that strategic thinking, community organizing, and willingness to accept short-term costs for long-term independence could prevent domination even by organizations with superior resources. The contract incident was never documented in official records. It appeared in no court files, no law enforcement reports, no journalistic accounts from the period. It existed only in oral histories and community memory, passed down through generations as an example of successful resistance to external control. But this lack of official documentation did not diminish its significance. In many ways, the absence of documentation enhanced the story's power. It showed that some of the most important events in history occurred outside official channels, beyond the view of mainstream institutions, in spaces where communities made decisions about their own futures without seeking external validation or recognition. The only contract Bumpy Johnson ever tore up was destroyed in an office on Madison Avenue on an October afternoon in 1947. But the aftermath of that destruction shaped power relationships, community organizing, and criminal operations in Harlem and throughout New York for decades. It demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and organization could accomplish what force alone could not. It showed that power came not from signing agreements that others prepared, but from building systems that made such agreements unnecessary or irrelevant. And it proved that sometimes the most consequential decisions were the ones that preserved independence at the cost of immediate gain, because independence was the foundation of all sustainable power.